You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my dad, Jake Reckward. We're doing this for the benefit of my son, Ben the Bear, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there. We're recording this and putting them all out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
Good. Oh, hi Mom. Hi everyone, a guest star. She's off camera. Hi. We're blowing kisses to each other. Okay. Bye, Mom. But tonight, we are reviewing Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 3, Episode 8, The Price, which debuted on November 13th, 1989, but has an in-universe star date of 43385.6 in the year 2366. I don't know how you feel about this episode, but in many ways, I have mixed emotions about it. On one hand, I think that this is a very good episode for Counselor Troy and Marina Sirtis as an actress. She gets to do a lot of great character work in this. But from a world building perspective, I watched this episode 3 times in preparation for our podcast. And I kept coming around to like all these questions about the world building that just didn't make sense to me. Though, when I went and did some research, and we'll talk about that as we dig into the episode, this episode right here served a little bit as the basis for DS9 and a episode later on in Voyager, which we'll get into. But, overall, I just think it's a mixed episode. I don't think it's a great episode. I don't think it's a bad episode either.
I agree, because one of the notes I made is thinking about this is that, and I think it's part of what we've talked about that in this third season, that there's been some maturation and refinement of the writing. Is like, these are stories in a science fiction setting, but they're more about, big human issues, as demonstrated through the interpersonal struggles of the characters. And, the main, when I look at my notes, I think the main thing that just sort of impressed me, or is the basis for discussion, is the whole issue of whether what Ral did was ethical versus, when Troy sort of accused him of being unethical in the way he negotiated and not revealing that he was a betazoid, that he had some telepathic ability. And he countered to her, well, you do the same thing for your captain. And it gets into, now I think of it, actually kind of gets back into, when you are in business negotiations or even geopolitical negotiations, if you can get intelligence through spying of what your other party or adversary, even to use that term, is doing, it's like all's fair in love and war. So I don't know if that ethical question is really ever answered here.
So let's build the episode a little bit and get to that actual conversation before we dive into it, because I think you bring up really the big crux of the episode. Really, this is going to be a conversation tonight about morals and ethics, among other things. But getting there, so let me get my notes. So The episode starts with Counselor Troy entering her quarters after what appears to be an exhausting day. She begins to read some letters from her mother and ignores a research inquiry originating from Canada in the Manitoba Journal of Interplanetary Psychology. And has this very interesting conversation with the computer about wanting to have a real chocolate sundae from her replicator, which unfortunately the replicator cannot create without a very clear description, but also replicators in the future are designed to give the most nutritional value. So she would get a chocolate sundae, but it would be a chocolate sundae that was kind of made to um, mimic a sundae without having any of the unnecessarily unhealthy parts, so to
The
speak.
the parts that provide maximum satisfaction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Um, I think that this scene is actually really interesting itself. First, in the fact that she is subscribed to psychology journals in the future, which makes a ton of sense if you think about what a counselor of a starship would probably be reading. But I find it interesting that out of all the places in the world, Manitoba has become the center for interplanetary psychology, at least on Earth. Um, it seems to me that the fact that scientific publishing is still going on in the 24th century is a good thing. Um, have yourself being involved in scientific publishing before. Um, do you have any reflections on the fact that people like her, specialists in her fields, are still reading scientific journals in the 24th century? That kind of thing's still around.
I didn't pick up on that point, but it's a good one because, in terms of it's kind of almost funny that you have the Manitoba Journal. Who knows how things changed after World War III? I mean, you know, Ephraim
Right.
Cochrane was at a former missile base where he developed warp drive. So Manitoba could be like Toronto in the 24th century. And the other
Right.
thing that's kind of intriguing is if you've got this intergalactic exchange of information, if a certain planet or culture wants to participate, like there's a lot in Voyager and in Deep Space Nine about medical exchange, interest like
Right.
Doctor who is it? The Denobulan guy in
Oh, Dr.
uh,
Phlox.
Dr. Phlox. He's very much into the Federation interspecies medical exchange and so on.
Right.
So, if you really want to, if you're a scientist, if you want to really take advantage of different ideas and different theories and experiments that are emerging, yeah, it would be very important in the future to have some sort of, streamlined within your own world exchange of information, and then interplanetary and intergalactic. Very
I
interesting.
want I wonder how quickly these journals form in the future, especially you brought up Dr. Phlox, and I completely forgot that aspect of the character. In Enterprise, Dr. Phlox is really into the fact that
Mm-hmm.
all of these planets, like you said, are coming together to have these medical exchanges. I wonder if, one thing that maybe predates the Federation are these kind of not publishing houses, but like medical consortiums of the future. Like, before you even have something like the Federation, you have the Vulcans and the humans exchanging medical data, or the Vulcans and the Denobulans and the Denobulans and the humans, and they're already forming organizations within themselves.
Well, you have well developed medical journals in specific areas that are international in scope now. I mean, that one
Mm-hmm.
journal that I pay attention to, Cornea, has you know uh, submissions from China, from
Mm-hmm.
Iran, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
from Russia, Latin America, all over the place. So, it's that kind of exchange of information is sort of exempt from, the geopolitical aspects and conflicts and so on. I mean, there's been a lot of exchange of medical information between Chinese infectious disease people and
Right.
infectious disease experts around the world. It's kind of like what we talked about last time. The Israeli and Palestinian physicians and ophthalmologists, many of them
Right.
place themselves above the the geopolitical conflicts and so forth because they're really dedicated to helping people and advancing the knowledge in their field.
Well, in many ways, science is in itself a form of diplomacy. Being able to come together and have people
Sure,
work together to
absolutely.
solve
Yeah.
mutual problems. I think, wow, I never really thought about it until we stumbled upon it here that maybe, the first people who are talking about things and actually laying down the road work, so to speak, on the way to intergalactic peace may not be the diplomats at all. It may be the people who are working together in a lab or just meeting together someplace at a conference who have,
Well,
who wouldn't talk to each other anyway, unless they didn't have this specific interest
well, a good
in a common
example, a
field.
a good necessary example is there's going to have to be a lot of collaboration between scientists and physicists and meteorologists and economists
Right.
just to solve the climate change issue, or just to, not to
Well,
solve but to address the climate change issue.
I need to find the article. I forget where I was reading it this morning, but if I can find it, I'll link it in the description to this episode below. One thing that they're talking about in the wake of climate change is not only do we need to work together on a more international basis to deal with these issues, but if we're going to actually explore space in the future, climate change really does have a huge impact on our ability to send rockets and ships up. So it will probably start to become an international mission if we actually want to send, really develop our space exploration abilities, where it's not going to be just China sending up a rocket and, them trying to get to Mars by themselves. Like, they may be able to do it, but in the future, the more optimal way and the best way to probably get around some of the hurdles climate change will put in front of us will probably be through international cooperation instead of having having individual sovereign nations try to push their own space missions. Um, but so getting back to the scene with Deanna, so the second interesting thing besides the scientific journal that I found interesting is this. So as a writer, I kind of look at little clues here to what the actual episode's going to be about. I always say the plot's always in the first 5 minutes. If you're really paying attention to the first 5 minutes of a
Mhm,
show,
mhm, mhm.
you can tell what the entire show is going to be about just by little clues in the dialogue and things that they run into. And I think this thing where she's talking to the computer about how she wants to have real chocolate with, like, a real sundae and real ice cream and real this, not something that is processed and made to be healthy for her. I think sets up one of the main clash between her and Raul this episode, where on one hand, Deanna lives in this very kind of, I don't want to say regimented, but very almost, and I don't want to say sterile, but it is almost a very sterile world where all of her creature comforts are provided for her. All the men around her are very civilized. Everyone's educated. No one's really acting out of place or acting in a way that goes outside of their normal behavior patterns. Most of the stuff she deals with on a daily basis is, the typical Starfleet officers, and these people are fairly disciplined and keep it together. I think in this chocolate speech, I think she's talking about she wants something kind of real and primal. And I think that's what she starts finding in this episode. And I think one of the main questions is, she keeps saying in this episode she doesn't know if she wants to, like, be out of control when it comes to her relationship with Rawl. And she later has this conversation with Beverly in this kind of gymnasium scene, where they talk about, like, what does it matter if the sex is good or if your toes are curling? But it has a very interesting viewpoint about our views on sex in the 24th century compared to our views on sex now. And I think even in 1989, when this came out, it I think there's a lot of things going on in here that are actually pretty revolutionary and very libertine in some ways.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but I think her speech here about chocolate is very much kind of setting up the entire storyline she's going to have with Ral, and the dichotomy of wanting this kind of real raw sexual relationship with this kind of cavalier, charismatic man that kind of just walks in and sweeps her off her feet,
Hmm.
versus kind of this controlled, predictable, but safe life that she lives and values because she actually has something out of it that is giving her personal affirmation and satisfaction.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that chocolate scene sets that up. But that chocolate scene is quickly ended when Captain Picard calls her to 10 forward, where they're having a um a small get together for the delegates who will be negotiating for the rights of the Barzan wormhole, which is the central crux of this episode. She goes to 10 forward, where everyone is waiting to see the Barzan wormhole appear because apparently there's a buildup in the accretion disk, which I have no clue what that is, and that causes the wormhole every 233 minutes to kind of pop into, um, I guess, a visible range of
Hmm.
perception
Hmm.
for people, at least in terms of their human eyes. Um, and you're able to see it, and people are able to go through. Though it seems like you're able to go through without the actual wormhole, at least projecting its physical presence. I know at one point, like Geordi and Data go in before it actually shows up. Um, but the Barzan wormhole appears, and this is where Devononi Ral, the attractive representative for the Chrysalians, appears with his attractive female companion, who we'll get into a conversation because there's a lot of discussion about sex, and I think what sex looks like in the future in the 24th century. And I don't want to I don't want this anyone at home to think I'm saying this in a derogatory way. Because I think sex work is work, and those people deserve dignity. But I think when Devonani Ral appears in this scene with his attractive female companion, I think that that's an escort.
I do too. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I think that says something very interesting about the future, where you could show up with an escort and people would not necessarily be skeeved out or creeped out by that, or even made to feel uncomfortable, where even today there is this kind of there's such a negative perception still around sex and sex work that I don't know anyone that would openly declare that they're bringing a prostitute to a gathering or an escort. But for Devonali Ral to do this, and later on when Deanna finds out that he's actually dismissed her and quote unquote sent her home, and Deanna is not turned off by that, I think that says something very interesting about the values in the 24th century when it comes to like people having open sexual relationships. Now, in a previous episode, I mentioned how, I have this running theory that William Riker and Deanna Troy are actually in a polyamorous relationship off and on. Um, and I think during this period that they're kind of in an off period where they're still very friends and they're still very close, but there's no sexual partnership between them.
Yeah, I mean that plays out because there's Rawl, figures out or senses that there is some sort of relationship between Riker and Deanna,
Right.
and he actually sees Riker as competition.
Right.
And Riker just doesn't respond to him like, "Hey, this is not an issue," other than right, rather than Riker not liking Ral and thinking he's an asshole.
Well, I think that there's a lot of interesting things about the Devononi Ral character that we'll get into. But before we get into that, the scene ends with them actually discussing what the Barzan wormhole is. So basically, the Barzan wormhole is the only stable wormhole known to exist that the Barzans believe is a ready access point to the distant gamma quadrant, where it seems everyone wants to get to. So, let me see. Let me catch up on our notes, folks. Sorry about this. So, one of the main world building focuses on this episode is around who is going to gain access to control of the wormhole, or who's going to control access to the wormhole to the gamma quadrant. I want to stick on this point for a while, just because I think it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You raised a good question in your notes. How can access to a wormhole be sold? AKA, how can you take a point in space and time and actually claim to have any sort of territorial rights over it? I think that that's actually a good question, because I think when we think about sovereignty and who controls and who protects our territory, the easiest way for us to think about it now, and it's sort of a 2D way, is how we patrol and protect our maritime borders. So, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe our border goes 12 miles out, and then after that, it's international waters.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And just to compare for those at home, and for Ben, if you're listening to this, this is late October of 2021. But to give a comparison about why this is important, so here in the U.S., once you go 12 miles out to sea, you're in international waters, which means we have no immediate jurisdiction there. If you go to a place like China, China in 2021 is arguing that they have control of the South China Sea, which is a very, very large area of water going far out, far out, much farther than 12 miles, correct, Dad?
Yes. Oh, yes.
And this is a big, and when we talk about issues like this, these are big issues of concern, because a lot of trade ships go through the South China Sea. It is a trade route for multiple nations. So when a nation says, we control the access point to a certain geographic area, we are talking about a very important point of power when it comes to international and even domestic and regional politics. So it's very interesting, because here in 2021, you and I can sit here and easily talk about the importance of maritime borders and maritime sovereignty, and protecting your territory. But in the 24th century, what does this mean when you have a wormhole that's just out there in space?
Well, it's a timely discussion because, I thought about this, like they're selling it. So, how did the Barzans or whoever, how did they get the deed to it, the title to it?
Right.
Is it just because it's in their territory, which gets into the issue that if it's in their space that they consider controlled, it's within their 12-mile limit. On that basis, you could say that they can own it, or at least own the access. And there's several things you bring up. The Chinese, the 9 dash lines in the South China Sea, which personally I think I don't agree with. It just is in the International Council of the Sea, whatever it's called, some UN has said it's not legal what China's doing. But there's issues like this come up because, for instance, there's certain rules as to what ships can go through the Bosphorus from the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara and then on into the Mediterranean. And there's issues coming up as the Arctic ice cap melts, so that there's going to be a northern passage between Europe and Asia, or actually between Europe and Asia, going up through the Greenland Strait, whatever, over Canada, down through the Bering Strait to Asia, which will save about 2 weeks and a lot of money and fuel. And there's a little bit of rancor between U.S. and Canada because there's a key passageway that the U.S. said, well, that's really an international passage. And there's Canadian territory on each side of this passage, and Canada saying no. And just the other day, with the geopolitics and military brinkmanship between China and Russia on one side and Japan, there were several Chinese and Russian ships that sailed through west to east through the strait. I forget the name of it, between Hokkaido and Honshu, and then they went out into the Pacific and then went through a much broader strait between or south of Kyushu, I guess the southern island of Japan, and some smaller islands. And it was to, flex their muscle. And they could do that, and the Japanese could just observe because I don't know the history of it, but those two straits are recognized as international passages. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting, and particularly the strait between Hokkaido and Honshu. It's very narrow. So it's like, it's 20 miles wide. So the whole area should be Japanese controlled territory. So it's like, okay, what was the history that made that an international waterway?
Right. And I wish I knew more about that to answer your question, but I think like the larger ramification of that is like, well, think about it. Like, if the Chinese are able to sail their navy into this small strait that's, only 20 miles wide, everyone can see them. And if it's international waters and they're not doing anything wrong, this is basically them provoking people.
Mm-hmm.
And it brings into the question, like,
it's good old battleship diplomacy.
Yes. And it brings into question, like, how do you really mediate? How do you really mediate peace with weapons, especially in places like the sea and on the ocean?
Well, and this discussion relates to things we've talked about in terms of the neutral zone between the Romulan Empire and the Federation territory.
Absolutely. Well, one thing that you brought up, like, okay, let's say the Barzan claim that this wormhole is theirs. So, how far is it from their planet? Because we never actually see the Barzan planet, I don't think.
No.
It's never. I don't think it's ever shown directly. At least nothing that I can remember at this very moment.
Right.
Okay, let's say a wormhole appeared around Mars, but there's no one living on Mars. But there's someone living on Earth, and we're the only ones in our solar system that can actually lay legal claim to this wormhole because there's no one else to do so. Does that mean our territory extends as far as Mars? Do you see where I'm getting with this? Like, where do you start determining a planet's territory in terms of its distance from its atmosphere outward?
I would just say there's two.
Do you think that they have an international law that determines that, or an intergalactic law?
There would be two ways that you could claim the territory. One is if there's two or more parties and there's agreements between those parties as to there's a 12-mile limit, or here's a neutral zone between two star empires, or number two is you have basically the military wherewithal to control that space, to keep intruders out that you don't want there.
Well, this is what Devononi Ral and I want to make sure I get Leor of the Caledonians talk about, and one of the reasons why Leor ultimately backs out of the bid for the Barzan wormhole. One thing that keeps coming up is kind of like the administrative costs, where the Federation keeps arguing first with the Federation negotiator Mendoza. I don't think he was actually given a first name. I think his name's just Mendoza.
Yeah.
But first it's Mendoza, and then after the Ferengi poison Mendoza,
Mhm.
it's William Riker. But one thing that constantly comes up into contention is that someone is going to have to administer who goes in and out of the wormhole. And part of administering that is deciding who's able to protect it. And the Chrysalians keep arguing, like, or Devononi Ral representing the Chrysalians makes this argument that, we have trade, we have science, we have all the things that the Federation has. We just don't have any of the baggage that they bring in terms of conflicts with other interstellar species. And the Federation makes the argument, it's like, well, we're obviously the Federation. Not only do we have the economic resources, we have the military resources to help you develop this into a significant point of trade. I think the interesting idea of having to administer the wormhole for the Barzans is that, and it's kind of my problem with this entire story, like, who the fuck are the Barzans? like, okay, they're taking bids for someone to administer and defend this wormhole for them so it develops into a stable center of trade for them, because they admit that their planet is basically inhospitable to the point where the Barzans have actually either evolved to wear kind of a mouth device. I think that is some sort of breathing
Mhm.
device.
Mhm.
Very interesting, in fact. Um, it's kind of and I know this is kind of an aside, but it seems like the Barzans have kind of evolved along with cybernetics to be able to actually integrate a cybernetic device into their their biological structure. In this
Mhm.
case, their mouth or jaw, to have some sort of air filter. But anyway, my problem with this is, if the Ferengi wanted to show up before, like, the bidding started, or when the Barzans gave out an invite to ask people to come and bid for their space, why did who's going to stop anyone before a bid is made or an agreement is reached from showing up and, like, conquering the Barzan? Or it it just seems like the Barzan are in such a weak position through all of this, throughout the entire episode, that the entire idea of anyone having to bid for them, like, if I were them, I would have just asked for the Federation, or I would have asked for someone outright. They're just not in a good place of negotiating power,
I think
ultimately.
I think what you found is just a weakness in the story where, and we've
Right.
come up with these before, where there's no good understanding presented as why the Barzan should have control, why they have the right to put it out for bid, and they just create this part of the story because it makes it interesting. It propels the story ahead.
Well, one thing that isn't established, like, the Barzan don't seem to be members of the Federation, and they're potentially entering into a trade agreement with either the Federation, the Ferengi, the Caledonians, represented by Leor. I always have to remember Leor of the
Right,
Caledonians to get that
right.
out. Um, or the Chrysalians, represented by Ral. Wait, I had that thought. Where come back here, thought. Um, I think, where was I going with this? Damn it! It'll come back to me. So, another aspect of all this. Oh, that's right. An, oh, that's right. Thank you. Um, if they're not a member of anything, they don't also seem to be warp capable. Like, if Picard, Picard has to ask to or Picard volunteers to host these negotiations because the planet Barzan so inhospitable. But how are the Barzan getting from point A to point B to even go out and see a wormhole? Like, we have no indication that they have any sort of interstellar travel or the ability to do so, because if they did, why would they have to rely on just a wormhole to develop some sort of economy? It seems to me like if they had the ability to develop warp drive, they would at least have the mineral resources or some sort of resource to get out there. You know what I mean?
Again, it's one of those situations like, okay, we're going to build this world. And some of the writers say, but what about this? What about that? It says, we're just going to let that go because we're going to build the story around this. But we're going to leave a lot of pieces out, of foundational pieces out. And I think that's what you're
Right.
identifying again.
Well, what do you think?
And let me ask you a question. Is that a weakness in the writing, or is that just something you have to do when you've got 47 minutes to tell a story on a television show?
I think on. I think it depends on the type of story you're trying to tell. And I think sometimes the weakness of Star Trek stories is that they want to tell two stories at once. And, like, you have to decide what you're going to pay more attention to. In this case, in the episode, they spend a lot more time paying attention to Counselor Troy and Devononi Ral than they do the world building aspects of the Barzan wormhole, even though it gets a lot of attention paid to it in terms of, like,
Right.
things Geordi and Data go
And
through and just kind of the intrigue around the negotiations.
I think we've
But you
talked
have to
about,
pick which one
yeah.
you're going to
I
prioritize.
think we've talked about that before. So there are times where they'll have two and even three different stories, and sometimes they intersect them and weave them together well, and other times
Yes.
they just don't. They just don't.
Well, I think the problem here is that there is such a flatness to the Barzan storyline itself. Like, the real spice of the story is between Troy and Rawl. Like,
Yes.
Troy and Rawl carry this episode, which is,
Yes.
at the beginning I said this is really a good episode for Marina Sirtis,
Right.
and it is. But
Yeah.
in terms of an overall plot, like, it's just a little bit flat. One thing I wanted to ask you, and you brought it up in your notes, and I thought it was a very good thing to ask. The Barzans are deficient in wealth, according to their
Mm.
premiere, which says something that some 24th century worlds are still economically deficient or not at the same level as others. Um, One thing that Ben and I are watching right now. Hi, Ben. We're watching Deep Space Nine, and we're at the point where the Dominion is infiltrating the Federation with changelings. And Cisco has gone to Earth, and there's this big conversation about the Federation doesn't want to have a war with the Dominion or have to worry about infiltration from the Dominion because they have spent so much time trying to make Earth paradise. And the idea of them going to war breaks the idea that Earth is paradise.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Earth is only paradise because it is basically the center of all of humanity's technological and cultural innovations.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if you were on a different planet, kind of at the outer limits of what the Alpha Quadrant is, or whatever the Federation territory is, your economic situation is probably very, very different. Um, what do you think it says that there are still planets like people like the Barzan who are still poor in the 21st century when you have all of these different organizations in this part of the galaxy that can actually provide them some sort of material or at least economic stability? Maybe not social stability, but economic stability, which is what these people seem to be looking for.
Yes. Restate that question again, real quick.
What do you think it says that there's still poverty in the galaxy? Or this sort of deficit?
I think it's one of the things that's come up. We've talked about that particularly Earth, is more or less a non-scarcity society. But there are other
Right.
worlds where there still is scarcity. And even in some cases, like with energy sources, the mining of dilithium for, the fuel for starships and for warp drives and so forth. There are strategic materials that
Mm-hmm.
are mined and traded still. Um,
Right.
so, I mean, that's so. I think one of the things we're finding as we get into this is that with the assumption that maybe Earth and more that there are more advanced worlds, planets that have gone beyond that are free of scarcity, but then there are others that aren't developed well. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, there's ones that aren't warp capable and they're not aware that there are other planets and cultures in the
Right. I think that's
galaxy.
one thing we often forget.
But there are cultures that understand they're not alone, but they still haven't matured, or because they don't have uh, material resources and so forth, they're economically weak or economically poor, however you would define an economy in the 24th
Mm-hmm.
century in general.
Well, one thing that we have to ask about all these economies in the 24th century in general is if they are so lacking, if they're so, if they are all post scarcity economies, um, what besides exploration, what is the material value of going out to the Gamma Quadrant? It would actually seem a lot more dangerous, if anything, if you could already provide for all your material resources to send something out 70,000 years on the idea that this one point in space is our only way to get there. But this is kind of, the idea of a stable wormhole actually forms the basis of Deep Space Nine, where a stable wormhole opens outside of Bajor or
Sure.
in Bajoran space,
And where does that
and
wormhole go?
that wormhole also goes to the Gamma Quadrant.
Well, I mean, here's a thought. I mean, is the Gamma Quadrant sort of like pre 1492 concept of the Far East, that there's
I
been
kind
some
of think so.
contact and we want to find either we sail west out into the unknown Western Sea or we keep going down the African coast to see if we can get that way. But at the same time, when you get to Voyager and they're stuck out in the Delta Quadrant, you're not finding a whole lot of neat stuff in the Delta Quadrant, it seems.
Well, one thing that's always kind of caught me about the discussions of the Gamma Quadrant and the Delta Quadrant in Star Trek is that the Gamma Quadrant has always been seen as this kind of desirable place in space to go, for trade or for civilizations or exploration. Like a lot of the episodes in DS9, when they go into the Gamma Quadrant, their Starfleet or the Bajorans are sending a ship through to either trade or explore. Um, I think one of the reasons why everyone doesn't want to go towards the Delta Quadrant is the understanding that the Borg came from that direction. So I think there's always kind of like, I don't know. I think when you look at like Earth mythology or our current mythology, we've always had this idea of going east. Well, we had this idea for a long time until Marco Polo did it. Like, you can keep going east into the magical Orient and discover an entire new world and bring back spices and culture. But then after we did that and confirmed that, you really could go to China and come back, afterwards it became the West. We wanted to go west and see what was out there and find the new world.
And, and,
Um,
and no one ever found Prester John.
yeah. Um, but
The
you
magical
know,
Christian kingdom, right?
but the thing about it is, it seems like the Gamma Quadrant is in some ways like they know it's out there and they know that there's civilization and they know that there's things to go and do and trade. In many ways, Star Trek kind of depicts the Gamma Quadrant as the mythical East of our Earth past.
how does the Beta Quadrant fit in? I remember we looked at that map, but
Oh, the Beta Quadrant's basically Klingon territory, it
okay,
seems.
okay, all right, that answers
And
that.
and a couple other big races. I think I think it just, and I'll link the map below, folks, but just off the top of my head, I think here in the Alpha Quadrant, it's the big five. It's the humans, the Andorians, the Vulcans, the Tellarites, and I think there's a fifth one. I can't remember the fifth one for the life
Mm-hmm,
of me.
mm-hmm.
But it seems the Beta Quadrant was it seems the Beta Quadrant was the Klingons, and I think the Cardassians. I may be wrong. I think the Cardassians are on the other side of us. Um, or it might be the Romulans. No, it's the Romulans are in the Beta Quadrant too, because the Romulans and the
Mm-hmm.
Klingons have to brush up against each other, and
Mm-hmm.
they once formed a larger neutral zone. Because
Right.
we actually used to have a neutral zone with the Klingons. We being
Mm-hmm.
Starfleet
Mm-hmm.
in world, folks. This is getting blurry. Um,
Right. Right.
so, one thing about the wormhole that is interesting is that they discover that it's actually unstable. And they do this by sending Geordi and Data through in a shuttle along with a Ferengi pod that's piloted by two of the Ferengi representatives who show up to make a bid. Um, a quick note about the Ferengi. This is just another. This is just kind of another episode where the Ferengi aren't used very well.
But one thing I
I
discovered, you will mention that these Ferengi end up getting lost. They get
oh
stuck
yeah.
in the Delta Quadrant, and then they make good, and they show up later in season 3 of Voyager.
Oh, you're right. They are they're
Yeah,
isn't that episode Rules of Acquisition or
I think it might be. Yeah, something I forget what it's
yeah.
called, but yeah. Oh, it's very much about the rules of acquisition. Yes.
You're right. I do remember that episode now. You're right. That's how they directly connect this episode with that episode.
Right. Right.
Another interesting thing about the Ferengis before we move on to them. Did you know that the Ferengis had poison blood, father?
Poison blood.
So they took. I want to get this straight because they. Oh yeah. So the Ferengi are um in the Ferengi quarters. Dr. Erdor is helping Goth set up a poison handshake that will make whoever he grasps have a severe
Oh yeah, yeah. Right.
allergic
Right.
reaction.
Yeah. Oh
And
sure.
from what I remember, he took it out of Goss's actual cells
Hmm.
and reapplied it to his palm.
Yeah, that's how they killed Mendoza.
Well, apparently, wait, does Mendoza die?
I can't remember whether he dies or
Oh no, he has a histaminic. Hist, he has a histamine reaction.
yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah.
He has a histemic reaction
Hmm.
and is unable to return to negotiations. That's
Right.
what I wrote down.
Right. Yeah.
Right,
Okay.
and he just disappears.
Right.
Um,
That's that's why I said I don't remember whether he died or not. Right. He just kind of exit stage. Right. Yeah.
you know what? One thing that was a criticism in season one, they tried to make the Ferengi out to be the main villains at one point, and I think it's just kind of stuff like this that really takes away from their villainy. Just it's kind of gaggy stuff a little bit. Suddenly they have poison blood. Oh, they're greedy. This is just not looking. This
I mean,
just isn't very good writing.
my impression of the Ferengi are, it's like their technology is very advanced, but they're such buffoons.
Right. It makes no sense. It's almost different from the Packlids. The Packlids from the previous episode where they kidnapped
Oh
Jordy.
yes, right, yeah.
the Packlids were at least redeemable in the fact that, like, they act stupid, but they're actually kind of cunning in a way that they appropriate technology and then suddenly use it to spring upon people.
Uh-huh.
The the Ferengi never win. They never do anything that's actually, kind of redeemable in terms of their villainy. And when I mean redeemable, like, affirmable. Like, you never have the feeling like these people are actually going to get their way. We're never at risk of the Ferengi actually winning. I just think that that's a weakness of the character. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
of the characters themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so let's get to the main concern of this show. Devononi Ral and Troy. The first part of it I want to talk about is, once these two meet each other, Troy goes back to her office and she actually starts looking into Devononi Ral. And one thing that I noticed is that he was. I want to make sure I got this part. Oh yeah, back in her office, Troy researches Rawls. She discovers that he was born on Earth in 2325 in Brussels in the European Alliance. So this is the first real reference in the show, and it's actually noted on Memory Alpha as being the first real reference that Earth is not actually a planet of one unified government. It's actually several governments coming together to form a united Earth. And there's been mention before of a European alliance, but there's apparently also like an African confederacy in the 24th century. And I think it's interesting that Earth, despite having unified itself, post warp and through the formation of the Federation in this post scarcity society, it says something about us that we still kind of have states and sovereignties in the future, even if they are just, maybe a little bit in name only. Like, I wonder in the future what the big difference is living in, like, Worf was raised in Minsk. And I think we had this conversation previously. Like, what was Worf's like? What was Worf's life like in Minsk versus what Geordie's life was like growing up in the African Confederation? Um, do they have really big standards of living, big differences in terms of standards of living, or if Earth is this post scarcity society, what is the difference between living in Russia versus living in Africa versus living in Brussels?
Um, it's hard to tell. I mean, my impression just is that what's happened post World War III is that there's evolving these larger political, geopolitical entities, so that the way Earth is unified, united Earth, is kind of like it's taking the U.S. model and just expanding it on a global basis, but you don't have.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems like there's no mention of the United States existing anymore. There's a North American consortium, a North American alliance, or
Right,
something like that.
right. Because Riker's from Anchorage, and he mentions it there. When we find out that he was from Anchorage. So the immediate thing that connects Devonali, Ral, and Troy is their Betazoid heritage. Ral senses Troy. Ral can sense Troy's stress, and Troy in turn can, I think, in some ways read Ral better in terms of what his actual intentions are. But it leads to them having this kind of like quick, fiery kind of sexual affair throughout the week of the negotiations. And it leads to this kind of bedroom debate between them about questions about, with their empathic powers, do they ever, stray across ethical and moral boundaries using their power to serve their various roles? Um, and do I? I'm kind of butchering this question. Um, I think you asked it a lot better at the beginning of the episode. Could you ask it again? when it's, summarizing the debate between them?
Yeah, my note specifically, I'll read it. The question is whether when one has a known advantage in a relationship or a negotiation, is there an ethical mandate to reveal such advantage? What about intelligence from spying operations, whether they be human intelligence or signals intelligence in geopolitics? Ral brings this point up with Troy when she advises Picard when meeting new species or being involved in many communications. And one example is um, uh, the 20th century human providing Picard with impressions of the Romulans in the neutral zone from season one.
Right.
And
So,
I think a key question is, you know, at what level are you manipulating if you have information or can gain information that your adversary or other party doesn't have? When does it cross the line and become manipulation? And the case here is made is that Raw is a manipulator.
oh yeah. Well, I think from every, one thing that we haven't really gotten around, one thing that bothers me about the Troy Raw relationship is I think that by nature of the character, he's very predatory. Like everything about him is about him winning or taking advantage of the situation to achieve his desired outcome. And, in kind of getting to this point, I'm going to try to answer yours. But from the moment he meets Troy, everything about him is him trying to get her into bed or get her to capitulate to his view of things or get her to even leave the Enterprise and come with him at the end, even after
Right.
he loses. Everything about Devononi Ral is about the betterment and benefit of Devononi Ral first and foremost, and he'll abandon everyone and everything to win. Um, and even though he has kind of like this moral and ethical awakening with Troy, there's very much a codependency of it where it's not necessarily natural or honest. It's very much I've been caught, and now the person I've been caught that's caught me, um, I have to find a way to like assuage this situation, essentially.
Well, to some degree, it goes back to your point of the dichotomy of being in control versus not in control, because
Right,
Raw is trying to control Troy, and Troy sort of
right.
realizes that, and she doesn't want to be controlled, and she wants to be in control of herself. And when Raw realizes that, he's not successful in controlling her or controlling the situation, that's where everything breaks down for him.
Well, one thing I think about and I think you brought up a very good point just now. Um, and you make a mention of it in your notes when it comes to Raw's interaction with Leor when the Chrysalians absorbed the Caledonian bid. Uh, Raw takes advantage and manipulates people into positions of weaker bargaining power, which he then uses to achieve his ends. Troy, when she is using her empathic abilities as a Beta Z, um, is doing it very much in situations where she's not necessarily in control, but she's trying to help reassert control. Like, for example, you brought up her helping Picard figure out, like, or, you brought up the example of the human from the 20th century, in the Neutral Zone episode in season one. Um, you brought up how she's there to help Picard kind of read the situation at the time. Well, she's not manipulating the situation when she does that. She's just using her natural ability to take um, to take stock of the situation and report to her captain for the express goal of keeping the crew safe. There's never any sort of ulterior motive of like, oh, if I save these people, I'm suddenly going to become rich, or oh, I'm suddenly going to get a commendation. Like, for Troy, her using her powers to help Jean-Luc Picard save the day is part of the job. And it's not something that she's quote unquote. I think the question here is, are you are you using your power appropriately, or are you exploiting your power to a selfish end? And I think ultimately, like, when it's definitely revealed that Raul and the Ferengi have been working together to make the Federation look bad in in the um in the deliberations over the Barzan wormhole, it's very clear that, like, the entire conversation is built around, um, I'm here to help versus I'm here to get what I want. And Raw's entire argument is built on the idea of I'm going to get what I want.
Well, one of the things I brought up is in negotiations, ideally, if you can create a win-win, that's
Mm-hmm.
that's the best. And it's like the definition of a compromise is that neither party walks away getting everything they want. So it's still a win-win. But what Rao is after, and sometimes in negotiations because of the situation, you can't avoid it. What Rao's after is really a win-lose, and
Yes.
and he may actually present a solution as a win-win when it really isn't because he's manipulated things.
Well, he at one point he mocks Riker when Riker joins the deliberations because Mendoza has been taken out of the contest. Um, at one point he says, if you need any help understanding the rules, just ask me, because Rawl is able to use his power to manipulate the rules whenever it suits him. Where, everyone else that doesn't have empathic powers, they're all playing by this sense of decorum and protocol, where Rawl is able to go in there and knowingly upset decorum and protocol,
Well,
to his advantage.
right. He changes the rules without telling others that he's changed the rules.
Well,
And
it's not even changing the rules; it's cheating at one point. Like,
well,
the
it
entire
is.
Ferengi thing is cheating.
And there's sort of an example I thought of, about this. It's like years ago when there was a decision to invite China to become part of the World Trade Organization. The thought
Mm-hmm.
was, okay, that well, if they come onto the world stage, if they play by the rules, that'll help them, you know, democratize more, be less authoritarian, and so forth. And what we found is, China, by letting them into the World Trade Organizations, everybody cheats a little bit because they're trying to win an advantage. But China's
Right.
basically just ignored a lot of the rules. That's like they had no intent of following the rules from the beginning. They just wanted to get
Right.
in for their advantage, for their own
Well,
advantage.
that's it right there. That's the difference right here. Troy's never really trying to take advantage. She's not necessarily playing a game or a contest. Like, all of her function is based around ultimately trying to save these people.
Yeah.
Um, you know, Devononi Ral is not even here to play by rules. He's just here to achieve an
Mm-hmm.
end.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some ways, like, does the goal define the morality of the situation? I think that may not be the right question, if I may push back on that. I think it's the intention of the people involved in the goal. Like, if the goal is okay, if the goal in this situation is to negotiate a fair outcome for the Barzan, where they get the economic benefit of the wormhole, but whoever administers and protects it for them gets the economic benefit of that administration and access to that wormhole, then, you know, um, there has to be this kind of understanding that um, everyone has to win in this situation. What Raul does from the very beginning is set out with the idea that, like, okay, my clients are going to win, but everyone else has to lose in pretty significant ways for that to happen. It's not even, he basically collapses Leor's bid by psychologically tricking him. He, even though he's involved with, we know he's involved with the Ferengi when it comes to the firing of the torpedo at the wormhole.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He could have known about the Ferengi's poisoning of Mendoza too, or at least he would have if he read their minds. Um, and then he goes out of his way to embarrass the Federation throughout the entire episode. Calling them warlike and saying that you'll be dragged into all sorts of baggage with them on an intergalactic geopolitical level. Um,
So you
he's
so
just a rather unsavory individual, and it comes
right.
out in how he goes through.
But to get back to the key point you're making here is it's not so much the goal as the intent of the individual or individuals in pursuit of the goal.
Yes, involved in the situation. It's the people involved. Well, like, for example, let's say, let me put it like this, and it's one that I think about a lot now, especially in 2021 when we talk about democracy. We grew up here in America with this narrative that the founding fathers formed this nation for the pursuit of life, liberty, for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In many ways, those are all more wonderful and moral things. Um, but if you look at like what the founding fathers did around this kind of shared agreement, it suddenly turns into a very different scenario where they allowed slavery, they created some economic monopolies for themselves, they created some corrupt backroom deals that directly benefited them uh, as appointed government officials. You start thinking about all these things and then you look at the course of American history and you just realize, like, it's great if people get in with the intention of building a stable democracy where people's, one vote, one person equals one vote, and your voice has as much representation as the next person in your government. But there was also this side intention of getting an economic benefit out of it and building kind of an economic empire to compete with England and France and all the other powers at the time. Like, we can't remove the cynical kind of cold aspect of this. To survive as a nation, you have to survive as a nation. You have to make money. You have to build an army. You have to protect your resources and your borders. But um we were raised with the story that the reason we built our armies, the reason why we have our borders, the reason why we protect our resources is because we're trying to build this democratic society built on the ideas of equality and justice and fair representation. But for that to happen, everyone involved has to be committed to that first. They can't be committed to, oh, well, I'm also going to make money on the side. You and I have talked about this when it comes to the medical profession. You can't have a profit motive in medicine if you're really going to put the best outcomes of the patient first. You can't just say, like, oh, I'm going to give this patient this heart medication because it's the best medication to deal with their arrhythmia or whatever's going on, but and then at the same time being like, well, I'm also prescribing them this medication because I'm getting a little bit of kickback from the pharmaceutical company that took me out to lunch and gave me all these notepads and, paid for my vacation. You can't do both of those things and still say that you're moral or that there's something ethical going on here. So my overall argument is that if you want a better society, if you want better democracies, if you just want better cultures, you have to have people involved that are there for actual better democracies, for better economies, for better cultures. And for and when I mean better, those people honestly have to leave out the personal enrichment or um, their own personal greed from the equation if it's going to work. And in some ways, what I'm asking is impossible. Not actually, I don't think it's impossible, but what I'm asking for is very hard. You have to put aside your own advancement and your own economic and social safety and be willing to take on a lot of sacrifice and hard work and a lot of shit and a lot of people barking down your back every time you fuck up. Um, but like if you're doing it for the right reason, like it usually turns out better than if you're doing it to make a buck.
It's I agree with you. You know, you're describing a very idyllic world, um, and
Which I think
people
Star Trek tries to present.
right, and people have to aspire to that. And with the both the angels and demons that exist within us, there has to be some sort of that's where ethics and
That's a
morality
wonderful way to
comes
put it.
in. That's where ethics and morality come in that works to balance things out. So that yeah, you have to be a little bit selfish so that you can survive and do your work and have a company and position that can grow and produce a better product or a better service and so forth. But you have to it can't be just totally selfish and greedy. And this is kind of what we've talked about before in terms of, the criticisms of modern capitalism and so on.
Well, you were just saying all that, and there was a part of me that cringed a little bit, and not because of anything that you said or that you were intending to say, but there was something in my head that when you were saying that, you have to have a little bit of greed. Like to a certain extent, you're right. You do have to have a little bit of selfishness. You do have to have this certain idea in your head of like, yes, I can do this. Yes, I do want this, but it has to be almost an altruistic greed. Like, yes, I want to be the engineer that figures out warp drive, or yes, I want to be the engineer that figures out how to create a better water purification system, or yes, I want to be the engineer that figures out how to make sure people aren't dying in these in
I mean,
these transporters.
it's the thing is the ego of this of the individual who's driving
Right.
this. It's totally self-serving, or there's going to be a degree of self-servicing. Just if you kind of equate that to greed and self-preservation and survival and
Well,
so forth. But there's got to be
well, I
balance.
can.
There's got to be balance into you know advancing the social contract, is advancing the society, and so on.
Well, I can speak personally for an example of how I think this works. So, I write fantasy. Um, I'm not necessarily the most famous fantasy author, clearly. I'm clearly not the most financially successful fantasy author. But, like, the reason I do this, and it's a little bit selfish, but I really like the work. I like doing the work, and I love finishing something with the idea that I can go on and do more work after it. Like, it's a little bit selfish, but I want to write so I can write some more. Um, I think that there's nothing morally or ethically wrong with that. Like, it's saying like I want to engineer so I can engineer some more, or I want to play music so I can play music some more. There's nothing morally or ethically wrong I'm doing by doing that. I don't think that there's anything wrong with, someone who works and you and I have been talking behind the scenes about a nonprofit, and that's something to talk about off camera so you folks at home don't get to hear about this, but using it as a little bit of example, people who want to work in the nonprofit just because they really do want to help people, and like their goal to actually being successful is to bring more money in so they can use that money to further the mission. Those people do exist. um I think that you can have that sort of selfish drive within you, but I don't think that you can have the selfish desire to see it manifest. And this is a little bit of the Bhagavad Gita again. I know we haven't mentioned that in a while, but one of the things that the Gita says is that you shouldn't focus on the results of your actions. You should just focus on your action and just, maintaining the purity and the best objective outcome of that action, but not focus on the outcome itself. Focus on the action. I think you can have a certain selfishness when it comes to the action, but if you're like Devononi Ral, who's more concerned about the win, you're you're starting to stray down a path where your intentions and your motivations start becoming very clouded. Versus Troy, Troy uses her powers very selfishly in a way
Hmm.
to protect
Hmm.
herself, but she also uses it to protect her friends. And she's
Yes.
not using it to Troy could use her powers to get rid of people. She could manipulate social situations. She could manipulate organizational hierarchies if she wanted to using her power, but she doesn't. The only thing that she really wants to do is learn how to use her power or use her power to the best of her ability to help others. There's a little bit of selfishness in that, and we'll actually deal with that later in an episode when she loses her powers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think that that's really the main difference. It really is the intention of the person.
Hmm.
Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that covers it pretty well.
Well, I think that we've actually covered this episode very well too. Before we go, Dad, do you have any last comments or parting comments about this episode?
Um, no, again, I think it really, as we've said, it was really a very Troy focus episode. We might mention that the way it all ends is that when who goes into the wormhole from the Enterprise, Geordi and
Oh, Jordy and
Data.
Data. So yeah.
Yeah.
So once they go into the wormhole, they actually end up in the Delta Quadrant. And realizing this, Jordy and Data take some measurements, and they realize that the Barzan wormhole is unfortunately unstable. And while you may enter from the Barzan side, you will be spat out maybe in the Delta Quadrant, maybe in the Gamma Quadrant, maybe any place in the universe. And unfortunately, that means over time, the wormhole, since it's unstable, is going to degrade. So ultimately, the Barzans, and this is something about the episode that I think is kind of shitty. Um,
Yes.
Barzans are basically left high and dry, and because we are able to rescue Geordi and Data, and we're able to clear things up with Devononi Ral, we're able to just go on. But the Barzans are fucked, folks.
When Geordi and Data come back and give the report, the Barzan said, "We're screwed." Yep, exactly.
Yeah, and then
Exactly.
we just leave the episode where it is.
Yep, that's it. That's it.
So, Dad, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you,
On
Jay.
that note,
Yeah, yeah. It was an
we
interesting
will be
episode.
yeah, absolutely. We'll be back next time for Star Trek Season 3, Episode 9. One of my personal favorites, Vengeance Factor. We'll see you all then.
Okay.
Night.
Good night. See you, Jay.
Bye.